Mattel is back, and they have a message for NES fans. They weren't kidding. It really is so bad. You remember Mattel, of course, the toy company that gave us Intellivision, arguably the most powerful and flexible console of the early 1980s, home to sports games that were so sophisticated that other consoles didn't catch up until years later. Intellivision got crushed by the Atari crash, and Mattel's earnings took it on the chin, forcing the company to leave video games and sell off the Intellivision business to a former executive. This, of course, resulted in a console vacuum in the US that Nintendo exploited to swoop in and turn the NES into a durable, dominant, popular gaming destination whose sales were well on their way to eclipsing both Atari's and Mattel's by 1989. Well, Mattel took notice. They were pissed. And their response was to take revenge by entering the NES business themselves and delivering a poison pill in the form of the Power Glove, arguably the worst accessory ever created for NES. Well, worst is doing a lot of lifting there. It's really more like a companion piece to Rob. As visually striking and iconic as it was useless, a device with full compatibility for only 2 games in total. But even that's not really fair. While the Power Glove seems risibly stupid as a product in hindsight, it came from a place of earnest enthusiasm for a high-tech future that still hasn't arrived. A vision of VR whose marketing looked kind of awesome compared to, say, Palmer Luckey doing whatever the hell that was on the cover of Time magazine. The Power Glove attempted to bring together a whole lot of things into a single product that theoretically let you play video games better. It didn't, but that's almost beside the point. Jake Rosen at Mental Floss put together a more or less definitive first-person account of the Power Glove in an oral history feature nearly a decade ago. And that shed a remarkable amount of light into the gadget's genesis and revealed the shocking fact that it wasn't just a dumb gimmick. No, it was a dumb gimmick rooted in futurism. The Power Glove actually had a lot in common with the Virtual Boy, an attempt to bring advanced, costly virtual reality access to home consumers at home consumer prices instead of the tens of thousands of dollars that the actual tech should have cost. And like Virtual Boy, the compromises involved in that downscaling effort turned the gadget into something that didn't work nearly as well as its creators had hoped. Where Virtual Boy would attempt to translate VR to Nintendo many years before it was viable, through 3D visualization, the premise behind the Power Glove was to break the virtual barrier through interface design. 1980s-style cathode ray tubes couldn't really do 3D graphics, so the Power Glove operated on the premise that visuals were less important to immersion than the user's actual physical interactions. Thus, a glove that allowed players to control objects on screen with gestures and motion tracking. The sensors on the Power Glove would track your movement and calculate the position of a corresponding avatar or element on screen, essentially putting you in the game, despite the game running on a standard NES attached to a 14-inch Zenith. In practice, this didn't really happen, and Mattel only made 2 games specifically for the Power Glove before dropping the product and dropping out of NES publishing. And one of those games didn't even make sense as a Power Glove experience. The tech for the Power Glove came about as a synthesis of projects that had emerged independently in the late 1970s and early 1980s, which snowballed after one of the creators was sacked by Atari as a result of the crash and turned into a wearable device, a $10,000 wearable device called the Data Glove. The Data Glove used analog fiber optic sensors and an ultrasonic predecessor to LiDAR in order to allow users to use their fingers to manipulate on-screen objects with fine detail, and the position of their forearm to adjust the position and angle of their interface with the screen. It was an impressive piece of technology for the era and found its way into a number of actual scientific applications for organizations like NASA. And then someone said, we should make a consumer version of this. At the same time, a marketing firm called AGE had been attempting to parlay their success with licensing 3D holographs to Hasbro or the Visionaries toy line into 3D video games. Through a long and litigious string of events, these 2 concepts came together in an NES-compatible glove that allowed players to control the action with motion, supposedly. In practice, not so much. In creating the Power Glove, Mattel's engineers had to jettison just about everything that made the Data Glove so precise and powerful. but Mattel's designers did at least have a great sense of play and kid appeal. And while their adapted version of the Data Glove barely functioned, it looked pretty cool in the same way that Sega's visor-like 3D shutter glasses and the NES Zapper looked cool. That is, by the standards of elder millennial children in the year 1989. Specifically, the Power Glove looked almost exactly like RoboCop's hand. It turned kids into cyberpunk warriors, as epitomized by Lucas destroying Rad Racer while brandishing his glove in the big-budget NES commercial The Wizard. The reality, of course, was that the LiDAR-like motion tracking had to be scaled way back, and the fiber optic analog finger inputs became cheap sensors with only a few possible inputs. And weirdly, despite being designed for immersive experiences that didn't exist on NES, the Power Glove didn't ship with any games that actually took advantage of its capabilities. The supposition being that the marketing for the device would center around existing games that kinda-sorta seemed appropriate, like Rad Racer and Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! The Power Glove had a lot of shortcomings in its shipped form, not least of which being that it was the opposite of an intuitive interface for gaming. The glove shipped with an enormous manual containing pages and pages of instructions and troubleshooting tips. These were rendered in comic strip form to help the medicine go down, but that doesn't change the fact that the controller demanded enormous patience and reference material in order to be even minimally usable. Mattel programmed about a dozen different preset control schemes into the glove that players could use for specific game types, and each of these requires a page or two of visual explanation. And all of that aside, the Power Glove is tiring to use. You have to hold your glove-equipped arm out ahead of you and keep it at a specific height so that it remains centered and calibrated, which means that it's only useful for as long as your right arm has the endurance to point straight ahead outward. Mattel would eventually ship a 3D game that did showcase the Power Glove's 3D tracking, but that wouldn't arrive until the end of 1990, by which point the product had been discontinued. And until that point, there was really only one game supposedly designed as a Power Glove compatible release. And I suppose we should get that out of the way, unfortunately. Work your body right. Bad Street's bad, all right. Or at least the Power Glove compatibility is. Honestly, it's not even bad so much as just bizarre and misaimed. Mattel's big gambit for their new peripheral was to launch a game that did very little to take advantage of it. First things first. I confess that I had forgotten exactly how bad Street Brawler plays. Last episode I compared it to POW, but they're not actually as similar as I remembered. Bad Street Brawler is not a 3D belt scroller that allows players to move into and out of the screen's third dimension, which would make sense for a device designed for 3D space. No, this is just a plain old kung fu-alike, where you move left or right and punch or kick everything that approaches you. I have to imagine that someone, somewhere, looked at a peripheral that fits over the hand and decided, well, a glove is like a fist and you use a fist to punch, so we should get a game about punching? And rather than localizing, say, Konamic boxing or something to kite off the good punch-out Power Glove vibes, Mattel instead looked a little more to the south and imported an Australian game. Yes, it's another Beam Software title, but this one is actually an original Beam creation, not just something that a licensor handed to Beam and said, figure it out. Perhaps that accounts for why it's kind of okay if you take it as a game on its own merits, instead of viewing it as a failed tie-in to a gimmicky peripheral. Bad Street Brawler is not as messy a game as Airwolf or Back to the Future. It's just a poor fit for the Power Glove, probably because it wasn't originally created for Power Glove, or for the NES for that matter. Bad Street Brawler was in fact 2 years old by the time it hit NES. Beam originally created it for microcomputers under the aegis of Melbourne House and Mindscape, who shipped it with two totally different titles: Bop and Rumble for Commodore 64 and Street Hassle for ZX Spectrum. I can understand the impetus to bring it to NES. Beam spent 1989 establishing themselves as an NES powerhouse, for better or for worse, so why not port an original creation that felt extremely arcade and console-oriented in nature? The game did undergo quite a few visual changes en route to the NES, with the bizarre enemy mobs of the computer games turning into short little mustachioed guys and such. The hero also underwent a significant visual change. On computers, protagonist Duke Davis was a burly-looking guy who walked around in a pair of shorts and very little else, punching people. On Spectrum, he was super beefy, and even had a boat anchor tattoo on his bicep, The manual text describes him as a former punk rocker and martial arts vigilante, but I think something about his bare-chested vibe as he walks around in a pair of tight shorts read a bit more Village People for the American NES audience at the time. I mean, just look at all the Parodius and Choaniki games that very definitely did not ship in America over the years. So Duke dons a bright yellow tank top to match his tight yellow shorts and high yellow boots. This has the side effect of rendering him utterly ridiculous looking and far less intimidating than his muscular computer counterparts. It also means he kind of looks like a poorly palette-swapped Duke Nukem, which, given his name, actually caused me to associate this game with the Duke Nukem series for a long time, no doubt to the infinite chagrin of Apogee. Though I'm surely the only idiot who made this mistake. And anyway, Duke Nukem didn't debut until 1991, so really it's on Apogee for deciding to create a dude who looked like this loser. Anyway, Duke Davis garishly makes his way through a stream of people whom he has decided deserve an extra legal beating. And he does it by unleashing the full fury of the Power Glove. Except that he doesn't have to. You can also just use the standard controller. That is, in fact, a far more pleasant way to work your way through Bad Street Brawler. Not that it's a gem of an experience in any case, mind you. It's a fully run-of-the-mill brawler that suffers from incredibly repetitive action and very little enemy variety across its 15 stages. To Beam's credit, they did attempt to add some variety to the action. Every time you enter a new stage, you gain access to two things. First, you learn a dopey aphorism, like, "Never trouble trouble unless trouble troubles you," or "An optimist is a guy who hasn't had much experience." Thanks, Duke. Second, and more importantly, you gain a different super attack that Duke can use up to 3 times in that level. It's not just the power moves that change between stages, even Duke's basic punch and kick moves change, forcing you to rethink how you approach combat anew every time you complete a stage. A task that, incidentally, can be pretty tough in and of itself. The enemies are unreasonably difficult here, but the game has insanely tight time limits, which forces you to power your way through bad guys as quickly as possible, and that leaves you prone to making sloppy mistakes in your haste. The variety of moves and animations is admirable, but overall I find it more frustrating than exciting. As for the super moves, each one uses the same activation input, A and B, simultaneously. Note that these abilities are not cumulative. Duke does not gain new powers to add to the old. Instead, each new super move supplants the previous one. You may have had a spinning tornado punch in one stage, but you'll have a headbutt in the next. And you won't know which until you begin the stage. Even the manual doesn't explain it. Every move uses the same activation input. You press A and B simultaneously. And this, I think, is where the game really falls flat with its supposed Power Glove tie-in. The Power Glove featured a greater variety of input states than the standard NES controller. You could use the standard controller that was built into the wrist panel of the glove, but it also included multiple programmable buttons to provide, for example, rapid fire or slow motion inputs for the basic buttons. But then on top of that, it had a motion detection feature through Wii sensor bar-like emitters. And it could sense several degrees of movement in most of the glove's fingers. All of this, to me, adds up to a missed opportunity. Had Beam and Mattel properly coordinated in the development of this game and peripheral, they could have given Duke a huge array of skills to perform with the use of the glove. Different degrees of finger flexion or specific programmed inputs could have opened up Duke's moveset to give Power Glove users an advantage over those schmucks restricted to the basic D pad. But instead, no. However you choose to play Bad Street Brawler, it works out the same in the end. Well, mostly the same. Except that the Power Glove experience is much worse, because this isn't a game suited for the peripheral at all. What a huge misfire, a terrible idea on every level. And for once, probably not Beam's fault. They're victims here too. Anyway, back to the Power Glove. It's wild that Mattel would re-enter the games biz with a product so simultaneously ambitious and compromised. On the other hand, I feel like it makes a lot of sense. Mattel ditched video games after the Atari crash nearly sank the company by taking down Intellivision, and by all accounts, they intended that divorce to be final. Mattel had plenty of successes with toy lines in the 1980s, but even after the NES bounced back, the company steered clear of video games, at least in the US. Despite the Intellivision mess, Mattel's Canadian branch seemingly had no reservations about getting back into the video games biz, and actually served as Nintendo's distributor in the region up until Nintendo established its own Canadian branch. Elsewhere in North America, though, Mattel steered clear. Even as competitors like Milton Bradley jumped back into games. They took the Power Glove, a toy that pushed technological boundaries in an economical way, to convince Mattel's executives to give it a go. And even then, according to former Mattel engineer Will Novak, it was really just one specific executive, Jill Barad, who believed in the product and pushed hard for it. And it kind of worked out. Mattel's engineers managed to scale a massively expensive piece of hyper-specialized interface tech down into a consumer-friendly format that could be manufactured for less than $20. No small feat. That includes the spatial sensors, the finger-based flex detectors, and a built-in NES controller with advanced input and programming options. The Power Glove was even fully adjustable and shipped in two sizes, one small enough to securely affix to a kid's arm, and the other large enough for most adults. And even though it didn't work all that well as a controller, the Power Glove was backed by insanely good marketing, including that memorable scene in Nintendo's theatrical commercial, The Wizard, and sold more than 1 million units in North America, plus another 300,000 or 400,000 in Japan, where it was distributed by a company called PAX. And perhaps most importantly, Mattel got out of the business again before things went bad. The company discontinued the Power Glove within a year, and then the company's US arm stayed well clear of video games for another decade. It wouldn't be until 1999 that Mattel finally returned to the console games business in full force in America, releasing a succession of PlayStation and Game Boy Color titles based on their own endemic toy lines, which make the Power Glove and its two sort of game releases a kooky little blip in Mattel's history. The one moment where the Intellivision guys overlapped with their replacement, the Nintendo guys. I mean, in the US. Elsewhere, it's a different story. But the US market is what we've always been talking about here, you know? Next time on NES Works, the console takes flight at last.